Lost in the Rockies, the courage of a police dog that changed everything is a touching tale of heroism, loyalty, and second chances. Officer Caleb Parker and his brave K-9 partner, Max, navigate dangerous terrain to rescue a lost girl, Sophie. During a storm, their bond and determination save lives, earning Max a well-deserved Medal of Bravery. The story doesn't stop there. Max's heroics inspire a new mission, training shelter dogs to become service animals and rescuers, giving them a second chance to make a difference. This heartwarming journey of trust and courage proves that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, even with 4 paws and a wagging tail. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts about Max and Caleb's inspiring journey in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to DG Story for more unforgettable tales like this one. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth as the Anderson family prepared for their weekend adventure. Nestled deep within the sprawling Rocky Mountains, their campsite offered stunning views of towering peaks and dense forests. It was a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of Denver, where they lived. Sophie Anderson, a bright-eyed 9-year-old, zipped up her puffy yellow jacket and bounced on her toes with excitement. "Come on, Dad, let's go exploring," she chirped, her curly brown hair bouncing with every step. Her father, Michael Anderson, smiled as he secured the tent poles into the soft ground. "In a minute, kiddo. Let's get the campsite set up first. Why don't you help me gather some firewood?" her mother, Linda, suggested, but Sophie had other plans. She was too captivated by the beauty around her: vivid green trees, chirping birds, and the sound of a nearby stream gurgling over rocks. As her parents busied themselves unpacking supplies, Sophie spotted something unusual: a bright red bird with a long tail fluttering just beyond the tree line. "It's so pretty," she whispered to herself, inching closer to get a better look. The bird hopped from branch to branch, teasing Sophie to follow. Without a second thought, she ventured further into the forest, her excitement clouding her sense of direction. The bird vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Sophie standing alone in a sea of towering pines. She turned to head back but realized she had no idea which way she came from. The once enchanting forest now felt overwhelming. The sunlight filtering through the trees cast long, eerie shadows, and every rustling sound made her heart race. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Panic began to creep in as Sophie wandered in what she thought was the right direction. The trees seemed to grow taller, the underbrush thicker. Her small boots tripped over roots and rocks, and soon she couldn't tell if she was moving forward or walking in circles. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, Linda turned to Michael, frowning. "Have you seen Sophie?" Michael looked up from the campfire he was building. "I thought she was with you." Their hearts sank simultaneously. They called out for her, their voices echoing into the forest. But only silence replied. "Stay here," Michael said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll look for her. If I don't find her in 15 minutes, we'll call for help." Linda nodded, clutching her phone tightly. About an hour later, Officer Caleb Parker parked his patrol SUV at the trailhead, his expression calm but focused. The Andersons had called 911 after failing to locate Sophie on their own, with the sun already beginning to dip behind the mountains. Time was of the essence. "Don't worry," Caleb reassured them as he unloaded his partner from the back seat. "We'll find her." Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat, hopped out of the vehicle, his tail wagging slightly in anticipation. He had been Officer Caleb's partner for 4 years, and the bond between them was unshakable. Caleb crouched down to Max's level, scratching behind his ears. "You ready for this, buddy?" Max let out a soft bark, his sharp amber eyes scanning his surroundings. The Andersons handed Caleb Sophie's jacket, which she had left behind at the campsite. Caleb held it up to Max. "Find her." "Max," he commanded. Max sniffed the fabric, his nose twitching as he locked onto the scent. Within moments, he was off, nose to the ground, leading Caleb into the forest. The Andersons stayed behind with another officer, watching anxiously as Caleb and Max disappeared into the dense woods. As Caleb followed Max, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had been on plenty of search and rescue missions, but every case involving a child hit differently. Max, however, was in his element, his movements swift and confident as he weaved through trees and underbrush. "We'll find her," Caleb muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the leash. "We always do." The forest grew denser as Sophie continued to wander, her small frame dwarfed by the towering trees around her. She clutched her arms tightly around herself, shivering as the temperature began to drop. The once pleasant forest air now felt cold and biting, and every sound, crackling leaves, distant bird calls, set her nerves on edge. "Mom? Dad?" Sophie called again, her voice hoarse from shouting. Still nothing. Her throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "Don't cry," she whispered to herself. "Mom says crying doesn't fix anything." Determined to stay calm, Sophie remembered what her father had taught her during a family hiking trip. If you're lost, stay in one place and wait for help. But as the sun dipped lower, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor, she wasn't sure if staying put was the best choice. Suddenly, she spotted a glimmer of hope, a narrow stream trickling between the rocks. She remembered another piece of advice her dad had shared. Streams often lead to bigger rivers or lakes, and where there's water, there are people. With a newfound sense of purpose, Sophie followed the stream. The ground beneath her boots grew softer, wetter, but she pressed on, ignoring her growing exhaustion. Meanwhile, Caleb and Max moved swiftly through the forest. Max's nose stayed glued to the ground, his keen senses locking onto Sophie's scent trail. Caleb jogged behind him, his flashlight cutting through the dimming light. "What do you have, Max?" Caleb asked, watching as Max paused and sniffed the air. The dog turned sharply to the left, his tail wagging slightly, and darted down a slope covered in dense underbrush. Caleb slid down after him, stumbling slightly on the uneven terrain. His pulse quickened as he realized they were heading toward a stream. "Smart girl," he muttered to himself. "She's trying to follow the water." Max barked suddenly, pulling Caleb out of his thoughts. The dog stopped at the edge of the stream, sniffing a patch of muddy ground. Caleb crouched down and saw them. Tiny boot prints, fresh and faint, leading downstream. "That's her," Caleb said, his voice filled with relief. He patted Max's side. "Good boy, let's keep moving." Further downstream, Sophie's small body trembled with cold. She'd been walking for what felt like hours, and her legs ached with every step. The stream was leading her downhill, but instead of finding a clearing or campsite, she was met with a steep ravine. The water trickled down the rocky slope, disappearing into a darker, deeper part of the forest. Sophie hesitated, biting her lip. The path forward looked dangerous, but turning back seemed impossible. As she stood there, deciding what to do, a low buzzing sound reached her ears. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "No," she whispered, spinning around to find the source. A large swarm of bees buzzed angrily just a few feet away, circling a fallen tree. Sophie's skin prickled with fear. She'd always been terrified of bees, not just because of their sting but because of her severe allergy. Her parents had always been careful to keep her EpiPen close, but now it was back at the campsite, far beyond her reach. The bees seemed agitated, perhaps disturbed by her movements near their hive. She took a shaky step back, but her foot slipped on the muddy ground, and she tumbled down the slope. She landed with a thud at the bottom of the ravine, her head spinning and her knees scraped raw. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rush of the stream nearby. Then the buzzing grew louder. Sophie scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her leg, and stumbled further into the ravine. She didn't dare look back. but tears streamed down her face as the reality of her situation hit her. "I need help," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Someone, please find me." Back on the trail, Caleb's radio crackled. "Officer Parker, what's your status?" "We've got a trail," Caleb replied, his voice steady despite the growing urgency. "She's following the stream. We're moving fast." "Copy that. Watch the weather, radars showing a storm rolling in." ETA 1 hour. Caleb glanced at the darkening sky, the clouds gathering thick and heavy over the mountains. A storm would complicate everything, from following Sophie's trail to keeping Max safe. "Understood. We'll move quickly," he said, clicking the radio off. Max barked again, this time more urgently, pulling Caleb's attention back to the ground. The dog darted forward, his movements more frantic than before. Caleb followed, his boots splashing through the shallow stream as the wind began to pick up around them. He trusted Max completely, but the storm looming overhead added a layer of tension he couldn't shake. If they didn't find Sophie soon, the rain would wash away her trail, and with it, their only hope of bringing her home. "Hang on, kid," Caleb muttered under his breath. "We're coming." The first drops of rain began to fall as Sophie limped along the bottom of the ravine. Each step sent sharp pain shooting through her leg, but she bit down hard on her lip, forcing herself to keep moving. The air grew colder, and the sky above darkened as the storm rolled in. She spotted a large boulder jutting out of the hillside, forming a small overhang. It wasn't much, but it would keep her dry for the moment. Sophie crawled underneath, curling up tightly and hugging her knees to her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the combination of fear, exhaustion, and the bee stings taking its toll. "I'm going to be okay," she whispered to herself, trying to fight back the tears. But deep down, she wasn't sure. Her parents' faces flashed in her mind, and she let out a small, broken sob. Further upstream, Caleb and Max pushed forward, now drenched from the steady downpour. The rain turned the ground to slick mud, making it harder for Caleb to keep his footing. His boots slipped on the uneven terrain, but he forced himself to stay focused on Max. The dog was tireless, darting through the underbrush with his nose low to the ground. Caleb could see the urgency in Max's every movement, as if the dog knew that time was running out. "Easy, Max," Caleb called, his voice cutting through the rain. "You're doing great, buddy." Max paused briefly, his ears swiveling as he sniffed the air. Then, without warning, he barked sharply and veered left, sprinting toward the ravine. "What is it, Max?" Caleb asked, hurrying to keep up. When he reached the edge of the ravine, he saw what had caught Max's attention. Fresh slide marks in the mud leading down the slope. "Good boy," Caleb said, his heart racing. "She must have gone down there." He scanned the steep incline, noting the rocks and roots jutting out like jagged teeth. It was a dangerous descent, but Caleb didn't hesitate. He unclipped Max's leash, trusting the dog to navigate the terrain on his own. "Go, Max," he commanded. "Find her." Max barked once and leapt down the slope, his powerful legs propelling him over rocks and through thick brush. Caleb followed more cautiously, gripping onto tree trunks and roots to keep from slipping. The rain poured harder now, turning the ravine into a muddy maze. Caleb's radio crackled as the dispatcher's voice came through. "Officer Parker, the storm's intensifying. Do you need backup?" "Not yet," Caleb replied, his voice strained as he struggled to keep his footing. "We're closing in. I'll update you soon." "Copy that. Stay safe." At the bottom of the ravine, Sophie's eyes fluttered open. She hadn't realized she'd dozed off, but the sound of thunder jolted her awake. Her body felt heavy, her legs numb from the cold. Then she heard it, movement in the distance. Her heart leapt. "Hello?" she called weakly. The sound grew louder, closer. Branches snapped, and leaves rustled as something approached. Sophie's hope turned to fear. What if it wasn't her parents or a rescuer? What if it was a bear? Or worse? She pressed herself tighter against the boulder, her small frame trembling as she stared into the darkness. Suddenly, a familiar sound broke through the rain, barking. "Max!" Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. The large German shepherd emerged from the shadows, his wet coat glistening in the dim light. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as Max approached her, wagging his tail gently. "You found me," she choked out, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his fur. Max nuzzled her hand, his warm presence instantly calming her. He barked again, this time louder, alerting Caleb to her location. "Sophie?" Caleb's voice echoed through the ravine. Moments later, he appeared, sliding down the last few feet of the muddy slope to reach her. Sophie burst into tears at the sight of him. "I thought no one would find me," she sobbed. Caleb knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said gently. "Max did a great job finding you." Sophie hugged Max tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur. But Caleb's relief was short-lived. He noticed Sophie's swollen wrist and pale complexion. "Have you been stung by anything?" he asked urgently. Sophie nodded, her face crumpling. "Bees. A lot of them." Caleb's chest tightened. He checked her pulse, which was weak and fast. "We need to get her out of here now," he muttered. The climb back up the ravine was treacherous. Caleb carried Sophie in his arms, slipping and stumbling on the slick ground. Max stayed close, his watchful eyes scanning their surroundings. Rain continued to pour, lightning illuminating the forest in brief, blinding flashes. Caleb's radio crackled again, but he couldn't afford to stop and answer. Every second counted. As they reached the top of the ravine, Caleb spotted headlights cutting through the rain. The backup team had arrived, bringing medical supplies and a stretcher. "She's stable, but she needs treatment fast," Caleb told the paramedics as he handed Sophie over. Sophie clung to Max until the last possible moment. "You're my hero," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Max wagged his tail weakly, his energy drained but his spirit unbroken. As Sophie was loaded into the ambulance, Caleb knelt beside Max, stroking his wet fur. "You did good, buddy," he said softly. "You saved her." The rain didn't let up as the ambulance carrying Sophie disappeared down the narrow, winding forest road. Caleb watched the red taillights fade into the distance, his shoulders heavy with both relief and exhaustion. Sophie was safe, for now, but the storm wasn't over, and neither was their night. Max stood at Caleb's side, his coat soaked and muddy, his ears twitching at the sound of distant thunder. Though his body was clearly fatigued, his posture remained alert, ready for whatever came next. "Come on, buddy," Caleb said, patting Max's side. "Let's get back to the trailhead before the storm traps us here." Caleb radioed the remaining search team to regroup. As he began the trek back toward the trailhead, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The wind howled through the trees, bending their tops in violent arcs. Mudslides were a real danger in weather like this, especially in the Rockies. As Caleb and Max trudged through the forest, the storm's fury seemed to intensify. The once firm ground turned into a treacherous sludge, and every step became a struggle. Caleb tightened his jacket around him, wiping rain from his face, but the visibility was near zero. Suddenly, Max froze, his ears perked, his nose lifted to the air. "What is it, Max?" Caleb asked, instinctively reaching for his flashlight. Max barked sharply, the sound cutting through the roar of the wind. He darted ahead, his paws splashing through muddy puddles. Caleb followed, his heart racing. The beam of his flashlight illuminated a collapsed tree blocking the trail. Beneath the massive trunk, Caleb could make out the crumpled form of a figure. "Oh no," Caleb muttered, rushing forward. It was a member of the backup search team, a young officer named Martinez. His leg was pinned beneath the tree, and his face was pale and twisted in pain. "Martinez," Caleb called, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" Martinez winced, his voice barely audible over the storm. "The tree came down. Couldn't move fast enough. Legs trapped." Caleb examined the situation quickly. The tree was too heavy to lift alone, and the rain-soaked ground made it nearly impossible to get proper footing. "Hang tight," Caleb said. "We'll get you out of here." Max barked again, pacing nervously as Caleb reached for his radio. "This is Parker," he said, speaking into the receiver. "I need immediate assistance on the East Trail. Officer Martinez is down, leg pinned under a fallen tree." The response crackled through the static. "Understood, Officer Parker. Nearest team is 20 minutes out. Can you stabilize him until then?" Caleb glanced at Martinez, whose breathing was shallow but steady. He was already showing signs of hypothermia. "We don't have 20 minutes, Caleb muttered. He scanned the area, his mind racing. The only solution was to improvise, using the few supplies he had. Caleb fashioned a makeshift lever out of a sturdy branch. "This is going to hurt," Caleb warned Martinez. "But we've got to get you free before that leg gets worse." With Max standing guard, Caleb braced the branch against the fallen tree and began applying pressure. The tree groaned under the strain but barely budged. Caleb's muscles burned as he pushed harder, his boots sliding in the mud. Finally, with a loud crack, the branch shifted the tree just enough for Martinez to pull his leg free. He cried out in pain, but the relief was immediate. "You're okay," Caleb said, helping Martinez sit up. "We'll get you out of here." But their relief was short-lived, as Caleb and Max prepared to move Martinez to safer ground. The distant rumble of thunder was joined by a deeper, more ominous sound, the unmistakable roar of rushing water. Caleb's stomach dropped. He turned toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the rain. What he saw made his blood run cold. A flash flood was barreling down the ravine, a wall of water carrying debris and uprooted trees in its path. "Move, now!" Caleb shouted, pulling Martinez to his feet. Max barked furiously, urging them forward. Caleb threw Martinez's arm over his shoulder, half carrying him as they scrambled up the slippery trail. The ground beneath them trembled as the floodwaters closed in. Max led the way, his instincts guiding him toward higher ground. Caleb followed, his legs burning with effort as he hauled Martinez uphill. The roar of the flood grew deafening, but just as the water reached their heels, they crested a ridge. Caleb collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Martinez groaned, clutching his injured leg. Max stood at the edge of the ridge, his fur matted and muddy, but his posture proud. He had done it again, saved them all. As the storm began to subside, Caleb radioed for a helicopter evacuation. The roar of the floodwaters faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades cutting through the air. Martinez was loaded onto the chopper first, his face etched with gratitude. "Thanks, Parker," he said weakly. "And you too. Max couldn't have made it without you." Caleb nodded, resting a hand on Max's head. "You're tougher than you look, Martinez. Hang in there." As the helicopter lifted off, Caleb and Max remained behind, watching the first rays of dawn break through the storm clouds. The forest, though battered and broken, seemed to glow with a renewed sense of peace. "You did good, Max," Caleb said softly. "Real good." Max wagged his tail, leaning into Caleb's side. Despite the chaos of the night, their bond felt stronger than ever. The forest was still and quiet, save for the occasional drip of rainwater falling from leaves and branches. Caleb and Max stood at the ridge, both soaked and battered from the night's ordeal. The distant sound of the helicopter faded into the horizon, leaving them alone once again in the wilderness. Caleb checked his watch. It was nearly dawn, the first light of day beginning to spill across the peaks of the Rockies. His body ached from the climb, and his muscles screamed for rest. But there was no time to stop now. The trailhead was still a mile away, and the storm had turned the once clear paths into a treacherous labyrinth of mud and debris. Let's get moving. Max, Caleb said, patting his partner's side. Max wagged his tail slightly, his energy clearly drained but his determination unwavering. Together, they began their descent down the ridge, Caleb using a sturdy branch as a makeshift walking stick to steady himself on the slippery terrain. As they trudged through the forest, Caleb couldn't help but reflect on the events of the night. Sophie's rescue had been a success, and Martinez had been evacuated safely. But the weight of what could have gone wrong lingered in his mind. "She's safe because of you," Caleb said, glancing at Max. The dog trotted ahead, his nose low to the ground, always alert. "You never give up, do you?" Max let out a soft bark, as if agreeing. The bond between them was something Caleb had always cherished. From the moment he was assigned to Max 4 years ago, the two had become inseparable. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a friend, and a hero in his own right. The trailhead finally came into view as the sun rose higher in the sky. Caleb's radio crackled to life. "Parker, this is dispatch. What's your status?" "We're almost back to the trailhead," Caleb replied, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Martinez was evacuated. The area's clear for now, but the storm caused a lot of damage. "I'll debrief when I'm back." "Copy that. Good work out there." Caleb clipped the radio back onto his vest and sighed in relief as they reached the trailhead. His SUV was still parked where he'd left it, its windshield streaked with mud and rain. He opened the back door for Max, who jumped in and curled up on the padded seat with a heavy sigh. Caleb grabbed a towel from the front seat and gently wiped the mud from Max's fur, his movements slow and deliberate. "You earned a rest, buddy," Caleb said softly. "I'll get us both some real food once we're back." Max let out a contented huff, his eyes closing as exhaustion finally overtook him. Back in town, Sophie's parents were waiting anxiously outside the hospital. When Caleb pulled into the parking lot, Linda and Michael Anderson ran to greet him. "Officer Parker," Linda called, her voice thick with emotion. "Is Max okay? Is he with you?" Caleb stepped out of the SUV and opened the back door, revealing Max, who wagged his tail weakly at the sight of the Andersons. "He's fine," Caleb said with a tired smile. "A little worn out, but nothing a good nap won't fix." Linda knelt down to Max's level, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving Sophie." Max leaned into her touch, his tail wagging a little faster. "How's Sophie?" Caleb asked, his tone turning serious. "She's doing well," Michael replied. "The doctors are treating her for mild hypothermia and the bee stings, but they say she's going to be okay." "She hasn't stopped talking about Max," Linda nodded, her smile trembling. "She says he's her hero." Inside the hospital, Sophie sat propped up on a bed, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face lit up when she saw Caleb and Max enter the room. "Max!" she cried, her voice filled with joy. Max trotted to her bedside, his tail wagging enthusiastically despite his exhaustion. Sophie reached out to hug him, burying her face in his fur. "You saved me," she whispered, her small voice trembling with gratitude. Caleb watched the interaction, his chest tightening with emotion. Moments like this were why he did what he did, why he and Max pushed themselves to the limit, even in the face of danger. "He's pretty special, isn't he?" Caleb said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Sophie nodded, her eyes never leaving Max. "Can I come visit him sometimes?" "At the police station," Caleb chuckled. "I think Max would like that." The Andersons stayed with Sophie as Caleb and Max prepared to leave. Before they walked out, Michael stopped Caleb, his expression serious. "We owe you everything," Michael said, extending his hand. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "You don't have to," Caleb replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Max and I were just doing our job. We're glad she's safe." Michael nodded, his eyes glistening. "Even so, thank you." Later that evening, back at the precinct, Max was greeted with cheers and pats on the back from the other officers. Someone had even hung a makeshift welcome home hero banner above his kennel. Max didn't seem to care about the attention, though. All he wanted was to curl up on his bed and sleep. Caleb sat beside him, resting a hand on his head. "Good work, partner," he murmured. "You've earned this." As Max drifted off to sleep, Caleb leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But even as his eyes closed, he couldn't help but smile. They had done it together. The precinct was unusually lively the next morning. News of Sophie's rescue had spread quickly, and Caleb and Max found themselves the center of attention. Local reporters were gathered outside, cameras ready to capture a story of courage and survival. Caleb leaned against his desk, sipping a cup of coffee while Max lay at his feet, chewing lazily on a well-deserved treat. Though the excitement was palpable, Caleb couldn't shake the lingering exhaustion from the storm and the events that followed. "Parker," a voice called from across the room. It was Captain Harris, striding toward him with a grin. "Great work out there last night. You and Max went above and beyond." "Thanks, Captain," Caleb replied. "We were just doing our job." "Well, the Anderson family doesn't see it that way," Harris said. "They sent over a letter this morning. Apparently, Sophie's been calling Max her guardian angel." Caleb glanced down at Max, who thumped his tail against the floor at the mention of his name. "Sounds about right," Caleb said with a chuckle. "And that's not all," Harris continued. "The mayor wants to recognize Max officially. They're planning a ceremony at City Hall next week. You both deserve it." Caleb blinked in surprise. "A ceremony? For Max?" Harris nodded. "He's a hero, Parker. People need to hear stories like this, especially now. It's a reminder of the good in the world." Caleb glanced down at Max again. The dog looked up at him, his amber eyes calm and steady, as if saying, "We did what we had to." "All right," Caleb said. "We'll be there." A week later, the City Hall auditorium was packed with people eager to celebrate the rescue. Families, officers, and reporters filled the seats, and a podium was set up at the front with a large banner that read, "Honoring our local heroes." Caleb stood off to the side with Max straightening his uniform and trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in his chest. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and he preferred staying out of the spotlight. Max, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered, his tail wagging as children approached to pet him. "You ready for this, buddy?" Caleb asked, scratching behind Max's ears. Max barked softly, his way of saying, "I've got this." The ceremony began with the mayor giving a heartfelt speech about bravery, teamwork, and the importance of community. She recounted Sophie's rescue in vivid detail, praising Max's keen instincts and Caleb's leadership. "And now," the mayor said, turning toward the pair, "we'd like to invite Officer Caleb Parker and his partner, Max, to the stage." The crowd erupted into applause as Caleb and Max made their way to the podium. Caleb adjusted the microphone, his throat suddenly dry. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm honored to be here today, but this isn't about me. It's about Max." He glanced down at the dog, who sat proudly by his side, his ears perked. "Max is more than just a police dog," Caleb continued. "He's a partner, a protector, and a constant reminder of what loyalty and courage look like." The night we rescued Sophie, Max didn't hesitate, not for a second. He pushed through exhaustion, rain, and danger because that's who he is. That's what he does. Caleb paused, his voice softening. "I've always believed that animals like Max teach us more than we realize. They show us what it means to care, to fight for what matters, and to never give up." The audience was silent, hanging onto his every word. "So, on behalf of Max and the entire K-9 unit," Caleb concluded, "thank you for recognizing his efforts. He deserves every bit of this." The crowd erupted into cheers as the mayor stepped forward, holding a medal engraved with the words for bravery and service. She knelt down, carefully placing the medal around Max's neck. Max wagged his tail furiously, earning laughter and applause from the crowd. "Let's hear it for Max," the mayor said, raising her hands. The room filled with cheers, whistles, and clapping as Max barked happily, soaking in the attention. After the ceremony, Sophie and her family approached Caleb, and Max. Sophie's eyes lit up as she held out a small handmade card. "This is for Max," she said shyly. Caleb took the card, his heart melting at the sight of Sophie's carefully drawn picture of Max with a superhero cape. "He'll love it," Caleb said with a smile, handing the card to Max as if the dog could read it. "Thank you again," Linda said, her voice filled with emotion. "We'll never forget what you did for our family." "It was all Max," Caleb replied, crouching down to Sophie's level. "He's the real hero," Sophie giggled as Max licked her face, his tail wagging wildly. "Mom says we might adopt a dog," Sophie said, her eyes sparkling. "Just like Max," Caleb grinned. "That's a great idea. There are plenty of amazing dogs out there waiting for a family." As the event wound down, Caleb and Max walked out of City Hall together, the medal around Max's neck catching the light of the setting sun. Caleb looked down at his partner, pride swelling in his chest. "You did good, Max," he said. Max barked softly, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. Together, they stepped into the evening, ready for whatever challenge came next. The days following the ceremony brought a sense of calm to Caleb and Max's routine. The station bustled as usual with calls and cases, but the memory of Sophie's rescue and the recognition they had received lingered in the air like a warm glow. Caleb often caught fellow officers stopping to pat Max on the head or toss him an extra treat. It was as if the whole precinct had rallied around the dog, recognizing him not just as a K-9 officer but as a true hero. Even Sophie stayed true to her word, visiting Max whenever her dad brought her by the station. Each time she arrived, Max would perk up, wagging his tail as she bounded toward him with a big grin. "Max!" she would exclaim, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You're spoiling him," Caleb joked one afternoon as Sophie handed Max a shiny new chew toy shaped like a bone. "He deserves it," Sophie replied firmly, her confidence growing with each visit. One chilly evening, as Caleb and Max prepared to head home after a long shift, Captain Harris approached them with a stack of files in hand. "Parker," Harris said, his tone serious, "we've got something for you." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" Harris handed him the file. "A missing hiker in the same area where you found Sophie. She went out yesterday morning and hasn't been seen since. Weather's clear, but the terrain is rough." Caleb's brow furrowed as he flipped through the report. The missing person was a young woman in her 20s, an experienced hiker named Grace Hartman. She had set out on a solo trip in the Rockies but hadn't returned when expected. "You think she's in trouble?" Caleb asked. "Her family does," Harris replied. "And given the conditions up there, I'm inclined to agree. You up for it?" Caleb glanced at Max, who stood alert beside him. His ears perked as if he already understood the situation. "Always," Caleb said. The following morning, Caleb and Max found themselves back in the Rockies, their SUV bouncing along the dirt road leading to the trailhead. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. As they arrived, they were greeted by Grace's parents, who looked pale and worn from a sleepless night. "Officer Parker," Grace's father said, shaking Caleb's hand firmly. "Please, you've got to find her. She's smart, but it's not like her to miss check-ins." "We'll do everything we can," Caleb promised. He crouched beside Max, holding out Grace's jacket, which her parents had brought from home. "Find her, Max," he commanded softly. Max sniffed the jacket intently, his nose twitching as he locked onto the scent. With a determined bark, he took off down the trail, Caleb close behind. The search was different this time. Unlike the stormy night when they rescued Sophie, the weather was clear and crisp, but the terrain was no less challenging. with narrow paths winding through steep cliffs and dense patches of forest. Caleb kept his eyes sharp, scanning for signs of Grace as Max led the way. Occasionally, Max would stop to sniff the air, his tail wagging slightly when he picked up her trail again. Hours passed, and Caleb's radio crackled with updates from other search teams. None of them had found anything yet, but Caleb trusted Max's instincts. "Good boy," Caleb murmured as Max paused at a fork in the trail, his ears swiveling. "What do you got?" Max barked sharply and took off to the left, his nose low to the ground. As they moved deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew quieter, almost unnervingly so. The chirping of birds and rustling of leaves had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Stay close, Max," he said, gripping his flashlight tightly. Suddenly, Max froze, his body stiffening. He let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on something ahead. "What is it?" Caleb whispered, stepping closer. Max barked, then darted forward, disappearing into the trees. Caleb followed, his heart pounding. When he reached the clearing, his breath caught in his throat. There, slumped against a tree, was Grace. Her face was pale, and she was shivering violently, clutching her ankle, which was swollen and bruised. She looked up as Caleb approached, her eyes wide with relief. "You found me," she said weakly. Max was already by her side, nuzzling her hand gently as if to reassure her. "Grace, I'm Officer Parker," Caleb said, kneeling beside her. "We're going to get you out of here." As Caleb assessed her condition, Grace explained what had happened. She had slipped on a patch of loose gravel and twisted her ankle, leaving her unable to continue the hike. "I tried to call for help," she said, her voice shaking, "but my phone died, and I didn't know if anyone would come looking." "Well, you've got a great family," Caleb said. "They weren't going to give up on you, and neither were we." He radioed for backup, then wrapped Grace in an emergency blanket to keep her warm. "You're going to be okay," he assured her. "Max and I will stay with you until help arrives." Grace reached out to pet Max, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb smiled, watching as Max leaned into her touch. When the rescue team finally arrived, Grace was safely transported back to the trailhead, where her family was waiting with tears of joy. "You've got an incredible dog," Grace's father said, shaking Caleb's hand once more. "I know," Caleb replied, glancing at Max. "He's the best." As they drove away from the trailhead, Caleb looked over at Max, who was sprawled out on the back seat, snoring softly. "Another mission accomplished," Caleb said with a grin. "What do you say, Max? Ready for a long nap?" Max's tail thumped against the seat in response, his way of saying, "Always." A few days after Grace Hartman's rescue, life at the precinct had settled back into its usual rhythm, or so Caleb thought. But that morning, as he walked into the station with Max by his side, something felt different. There was a buzz of activity, officers whispering and glancing his way as he passed. "What's going on?" Caleb asked, stopping by his partner Officer Jensen's desk. "You didn't hear?" Jensen said, grinning. "You've got a visitor waiting in the conference room. Looks official." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What kind of visitor?" Jensen shrugged, but the smirk on his face hinted that he knew more than he was letting on. "Guess you'll have to find out." With Max trotting faithfully at his heels, Caleb made his way to the conference room. When he opened the door, he was greeted by an unexpected sight: a representative from the state governor's office, flanked by a photographer and a few local officials. "Officer Parker," the representative said warmly, stepping forward to shake his hand. "Thank you for meeting with us." Caleb blinked in surprise. "Of course. What's this about?" The representative gestured toward Max, who was already sitting obediently by Caleb's side. "We're here to formally recognize Max for his extraordinary service. The governor himself has heard about your recent rescues, and he wanted to ensure Max's bravery didn't go unnoticed." Caleb couldn't help but smile as he looked down at Max. "He deserves it," he said simply. Within the hour, the small gathering turned into an impromptu ceremony. Max was presented with a special commendation from the governor's office, along with a custom-made collar adorned with the words "Hero of the Rockies." The photographer snapped pictures of Max wearing his new collar, his tail wagging furiously as Caleb held up the certificate for the camera. "Max," Caleb said softly, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "You're getting pretty good at this whole celebrity thing," Max barked in response, earning a laugh from the room. The recognition didn't stop there. Later that week, Caleb received a phone call from a local animal rescue organization, inviting him and Max to speak at their upcoming fundraiser. "It's all about raising awareness for shelter animals and the amazing things they can do," the organizer explained. "Max's story is exactly the kind of inspiration we want to share." Caleb hesitated for a moment. He wasn't one for public speaking, but the thought of helping other animals like Max find homes tugged at his heart. "Count us in," he said. The fundraiser was held at a large community center, filled with families, shelter volunteers, and, of course, plenty of wagging tails. Caleb and Max were the guests of honor, with a table set up displaying photos and stories of Max's career as a K-9 officer. As Caleb spoke about Max's rescues, the audience listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and emotion. "Max isn't just a working dog," Caleb said, glancing down at his partner, who sat calmly at his side. "He's a reminder of what animals are capable of when given a chance. Every dog has potential, whether they're serving in law enforcement or just being a loyal companion at home." The crowd erupted into applause as Caleb finished, and Max barked on cue, earning a round of laughter. After the speech, families lined up to meet Max, many of them asking Caleb questions about adopting shelter dogs. Sophie and her family were among the crowd, and she beamed as Max greeted her with his signature wagging tail. "We're visiting the shelter tomorrow," Sophie said excitedly. "I want to find a dog who needs me as much as I need them." Caleb smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Moments like this made all the challenges of his job worthwhile. As the evening wound down, the shelter organizer approached Caleb with an idea. "We've been thinking about starting a program to train rescue dogs as service animals or search and rescue partners," she said. "With your experience, maybe you and Max could help us get it off the ground." Caleb glanced at Max, who was sprawled out on the floor, clearly enjoying the attention of several children petting him. The idea sparked something in him, a way to give back, to pay forward all the good that Max had brought into his life. "I think we'd like that," Caleb said, nodding. The next morning, Caleb found himself back at the precinct, filling out paperwork for the new program. He couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement as he outlined plans for training sessions, adoption outreach, and community events. Max, as always, was right by his side, watching Caleb with those sharp amber eyes that seemed to say, "What's next, partner?" "Well, Max," Caleb said, leaning back in his chair, "looks like we've got a whole new mission ahead of us." Max wagged his tail, his energy renewed by the promise of more adventures to come.